Many chess players don't seem to know how to handle the Alekhines defense. I'm talking about e4 knight f6. This might not look attractive, but hey, you should only skip this video at your own risk, because what I'm about to reveal to you guys is high-level chess, something you can use to confuse many chess players, and I promise you're going to win a lot of games with the Alekhine defense. Look into the Masters database. Carlsen has played this several times, even Nakamura. So you can see only top players. Caruana has also played this. So it is one defense that should not be underrated. Let me show you a little bit of theory in the Alekhines. So the top played move from here is pawn to e5. The other common move you're going to see is knight c3. If anything, I want you guys to jot this down. Knight c3 is what many people are playing nowadays. So we're going to end with that. The other common move you're going to see is bishop c4, which comes with a little trap that I have covered in my videos several times, but I'll show you how to handle that. So let's begin with the top played move, pawn to e5. Against this, the move you want to play is knight d5, period. White can play pawn to d4, pawn to c4, knight c3, and even knight to f3. After pawn to d4, there are two ways you can continue this line. You can either go straight into the main line with pawn to d6. Hey, remember, the pawn you always want to move in the Alekhines defense is the d pawn, not the e pawn. I'm not saying moving the e pawn is losing, but positionally speaking, you want to pave way for your light squad bishop. And the other reason for developing pawn to d6 first is putting pressure on the e5 pawn. If you play pawn to e6, you're not putting pressure on any of white's pawns, as you can see. So as I was saying, there are two ways in which you can continue from here. You can play pawn to d6, or play the O'Sullivan Gambit, which is suitable for rapid, blitz, and bullet. This is where you just sacrifice two of your queenside pawns, like b5, and after bishop takes, you go pawn to c5. If pawn takes, you go queen a5 check, so that at the end of the day, you may win a free bishop like this. So this is the O'Sullivan Gambit, but that's not the main area of my interest in today's video. You're not going to play pawn to b5 in serious tournaments. Before I proceed, this video is sponsored by all of our paid members on Patreon. These are the guys who support Casper Chess financially. In return, we give them extra study materials and other premium content on Patreon to thank them in style. Not to mention that all of our patrons are at liberty to make video requests and ask any chess related questions. You can join free membership and pay later if you want through the link in the comment section down below. Now, let's continue. The move I want you guys to play is pawn to d6. The idea is just to take on e5, even if white plays pawn to f4 on the next move. In this position, white will play either pawn to c4 or knight f3. Let's begin with the most forcing line, c4. Well, the response is obvious. You just retreat your knight to b6, and if they play pawn to f4, now you are happy to take on e5 like this. Pap. Most of the times they won't take with their d pawn because they are afraid you're going to take their queen with tempo, also taking away their castling rights. So nobody does that. In case you're wondering, they take back with their f pawn. And now hold on, why do I think the Alekhines defense is best by test? See, from here, all you're going to be doing is developing your pieces with tempo. Just attack, attack, and attack. Because the more you attack, the more you give your opponents many chances to blunder. What would you play in this position? Pawn to g6 is not an attacking move. Bishop f5 is not an attacking move. Even pawn to e6, that's not an attacking move. So the move you want to play in this position, with all due respect, is knight c6, because you are attacking the d4 pawn twice. Now on lichess, this is where most people play knight to f3. I'll tell you what, bishop e3 is a move that grandmasters advise. If knight to f3, this gives you tempo. You develop your light squad bishop with tempo. You just want to mess up white's pawn structure. For example, if they play bishop e3 this time, see what I'm talking about? You do this, you take the knight, because if queen takes f3, you're going to take the d pawn. If pawn takes, now this is when you play e6, and your development will be very easy if you think about it. Knight c3, queen h4 check, bishop f2, queen f4. If queen d2, you can easily take. So I feel it is simple to play the Alekhines defense once you reach this stage. c4 can be met with knight b6. If anything else, like an early pawn to f4, you know what to do. You just go ahead and take on e5, and they'll always take back with their f pawn. Now this is a different line that I'm showing you now. By the way, there is less memorization needed in the Alekhines defense. This is one thing I like about this defense. For example, bishop f5 is playable in this position. Knight c6 is also playable, but I've seen grandmasters playing pawn to c5 even in this position. So the idea is just to go bishop f5, and sooner or later if c4 happens, they then go knight b4 followed by knight d3 check or knight c2, provided the light squared bishop is already out of the game. But anyways, this is for grandmasters. Once again, after d4 you just want to play d6. If c4 you go knight b6 and think of taking. If pawn to f4 you just take. After pawn takes, instead of pawn to c5 you just go knight c6. Stick to what you know. And these are moments where you will see your opponents playing pawn to c4, where you'd want to go knight b6. So this is kind of transposed if you think about it. It's just like we saw before. It's like we just developed knight c6 attacking the d4 pawn twice. And remember I said if knight f3 you just go bishop g4, get rid of that knight and play pawn to e6 to go queen h4 check. But what if white plays bishop e3 in this position instead of knight f3, not allowing you to go bishop g4? Well, if you don't have bishop g4, the other move you can play is simply bishop f5. Just like in a Caro-Kann defense, you want to play pawn to e6, developing your light squared bishop out of the pawn chain. By the way, if pawn to d5, you just take. Once again, there's not much theory involved. Most of your opponents will play knight c3 by this time, after which you go pawn to e6. By the way, even after knight f3, you don't have to move the same piece twice. You can just go pawn to e6 and continue with your development. So knight c3, pawn to e6, knight f3, bishop e7, simple chess. If white plays pawn to d5 this time, here is how you deal with this. Just take. You just take so that you open the center of the board. If they take back with their c pawn attacking your knight, this is when you can go knight b4. Don't be risk averse. There's no point for you to retreat your knight back to b8, even though that's fine. Knight b4 comes with a threat. You want to give a check. And this is why most of your opponents will play knight d4. This is all theory that I'm showing you, meaning it's what chess experts play. With knight d4, they are attacking your bishop and also preventing you from giving a check. Now, this is why you need to be careful, and this is why I'm going to end with this line. After knight d4, if you play bishop g6, you are giving away your center. Maybe on the next move, white may play pawn to e6 or start with bishop b5 check first. And there's little that you are going to do. So the best move in this position, and where I'm going to end, which I want you guys to always remember, write that in your notebooks, is bishop d7. Why bishop d7? First, you are stopping bishop b5 check. Secondly, you are preparing for this. So that if e6 is played, at least you can just take, and after pawn takes, you go bishop c6. Still, white doesn't have bishop b5. If a3, you even have this little tactic, beginning with bishop h4 check. If g3, you just take the rook, and on the next move, you're going to save one of your minor pieces like this. So you always want to play bishop d7 when you reach this stage. This is the only important thing you need to know. Instead of pawn to e6, if they play pawn to a3, the plan is just to take the d5 pawn, and here you're fine. Now back to the initial position: e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, d4, and pawn to d6. Instead of c4 or pawn to f4 immediately, where you take, what if white plays knight f3? Knight f3 is the top played move in this exact position. Again, here is how simple it is to play the Alekhines defense. As always, you always start with bishop g4, pinning the knight. You just want to take. If c4, you already know what to do. This time, if white takes, the pawn you always want to take back with is the e pawn. I know c takes d6 looks great, but you only want to take back with your c pawn if you intend to fianchetto your bishop. E takes d6 paves way for your dark squared bishop, so this comes with tempo. Bishop e2, bishop e7, castle short, castle short. So you got out of the opening stage very safely. If h3, by the way, you can take or retreat your bishop, that's okay. In fact, what I like doing is bishop h5, and after knight c3, I also develop my knight. Later on, the plan is to put two of my bishops on these highlighted squares, and the game will be complicated from there. Now, after e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, d4, and d6. Question: what do you do if white plays pawn takes? This may happen after pawn to c4 or after knight f3, even after pawn to f4. But anyways, let's just address this once and for all. Whenever you see e takes d6, the pawn you always want to take back with is your e pawn, so that you pave way for your dark squared bishop and castle short. If you want to take back with your c pawn, be ready to fianchetto your bishop and castle short. So I find e takes d6 to be handy, so I just wanted to make a point. Again, if pawn to c4, you go knight b6. If knight c3, you go bishop e7. Simple development. Knight f3, bishop g4, bishop d3, castle short. Now at this point, white is scared to face bishop g4 after knight f3, which is why you always see them playing knight je2 as evidenced in the master's database. You can see that. The point is, if you play bishop g4, that won't count as a pin really. But anyways, another move you can consider playing is pawn to c6, but here I wouldn't mind playing bishop g4 anyways. It's just the opening stage. If pawn to f3, I just retreat my bishop, challenging white's slice squared bishop. If castle short, I go knight c6. It's just a developmental move. Pawn to d5. Thanks for giving me the e5 square. Maybe one day I might even put my knight on g6, retreating my bishop back to d7. Now after knight d5 and e5, it's not every time you're going to see your opponents playing pawn to d4. In fact, they love playing pawn to c4. Whenever you see pawn to c4, just go knight b6, that's all. If c5, you go back to the red outpost. An outpost is a place where you place your knight such that it cannot be attacked by your opponent's pawns, or a place where your knight can never be attacked by your opponent's pawns. In this case, this is a great outpost for our knight. Anyway, we'll look at this later. After pawn to c4 and knight b6, they play pawn to d4 most of the times. Question: which pawn do you want to move first between the e pawn and the d pawn? What did I say? Well, it is the d pawn, simply because you want to put more pressure on the e5 square. For example, if pawn to a4, you just take, and after pawn takes, what next? You put more pressure on the d4 pawn. It's all about pressurizing your opponents. If knight f3, you develop your other bishop, capture, play pawn to e6, give a check. But if bishop e3, you don't have bishop g4, so you go bishop f5 this time, just like what you do in the Caro-Kann. If knight c3, you go pawn to e6, and on the next move, it's up to you to go bishop g4, take, or continue playing neutral moves, bishop e7, castle short. In most cases, we don't want to give up our bishop pair. For example, bishop b4 might look fine, but after pawn to a3, what are you doing? If you go back, you just helped white to develop their pawns on the queen side. If you take on c3, that looks great, but you just gave up your bishop pair for nothing. So that's why we always want to put our dark squared bishop on e7 rather than on b4. Forget about bishop b4 in the Alekhines. Just go bishop a7, castle short. So now you know that even in the c4 line, the game might transpose back if white plays pawn to d4. You just go pawn to d6 and wait for white to go f4 so that you take. But in this position, white may again take on d6. Question: which pawn do you want to take back with if you don't want to fianchetto your dark squared bishop? Well, the answer is the e pawn. You always want to take back with your e pawn if you don't want to fianchetto your bishop. Again, if you take back with your c pawn, this will look like the perk defense, right? Where you put your d pawn on d6 and your g pawn on g6. So if you don't intend to play in that style, just take with your e pawn. After all, this comes with a tempo. On the next move, you might just develop your pieces very fast. If bishop d3, you castle short, or simply go knight c6 first. For some reason, I find knight c6 to be a great prophylactic move. This comes with an attack on the d4 pawn, and it somehow forces white to play knight f3 so that you go bishop g4 if you think about it. So never be ashamed of developing your knights first before doing anything else. If pawn to d5, again you have knight e5. So this is one knight maneuver you always want to remember. In the Alekhines defense, this knight not only attacks the light squared bishop, but also the c4 pawn. For example, if bishop c1, you just take. If b3, you can retreat, but here you even have a clever move, bishop f6, pap, pap. If queen check, you can even go king f8. Anyway, so this is to say, after e takes d6, knight c3 and bishop e7, you can delay castle short and develop your knight first just to force knight f3 or some other lines. So you go knight c6. Even after bishop e3, by the way, you can still go knight c6. Yes, attacking nothing, but maybe who knows, white may advance their d pawn so that they allow you to double attack that c4 pawn. So knight c6 is always a neutral move. Consider playing it. You can delay castle and see what white has prepared. e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, and c4. Again, you always go knight b6. Now, instead of pawn to d4, which may transpose back to the main line, there is this other annoying move order where white plays pawn to c5, forcing you to go back somehow, and only then do they play knight c3 or bishop c4. Let's start with knight c3. What I like doing in such instances is to play pawn to e6. Even though pawn to c6 looks attractive, and I will explain explain, the move I will consider is pawn to e6 for a reason, because e6 comes with a tempo. So in the Alekhines defense, the secret is to play moves that come with tempo. For example, pawn to e6 not only guards the knight but also poses a threat indirectly. Your bishop is attacking the c5 pawn. If knight takes, you take back, and after pawn to d4, you start opening up the position immediately with the move pawn to d6. You just want to take on e5, so that next you take on c5. So again, the advantage of starting with pawn to e6 in the Alekhines is that you indirectly attack the c5 pawn, and you also pave way for your queen if you think about it. So that's why e6 is favored over pawn to c6. Pawn to c6 is okay, but it's kinda slow if you think about it. Yes, you have to go into tactics like you play pawn to d6, but this may be complicated after queen b3. White doesn't even have to take immediately. So to oversimplify things, just go pawn to e6 and attack that pawn. If white doesn't take immediately, and let's say they just protect their pawns like this, once again, you always want to play pawn to d6. So this is the only thing you need to know in this line where white plays e5 and pawn to c5. Start with e6 and then consider playing d6 on the next move, regardless of what white does. So e6, d4, and pawn to d6. Great stuff. If anything, you just want to take the e pawn so that the c pawn remains vulnerable. That's what you want to do. On lichess, c takes d6 is the top played move, after which you take back like this. They play knight f3, but to oversimplify things, you can start by taking on c3. So that after pawn takes, this is when you may take back on e5, or even better, go queen c7 to attack something. You know, if pawn takes, you're going to develop your bishop with tempo. So they play bishop d2, and now this is when you go after the e5 pawn with the move knight d7, kind of forcing a trade to happen. So this is where we see e takes d6 happening, and then you take back with your bishop. Simple stuff. After bishop d3, see, there's no way you can develop your light squared bishop along this diagonal. So this is where you want to put it on b7. You can do that after castle shot or right away. There's no harm. Castle shot, bishop b7, look at this, maybe h3, and then you castle shot. Rook c8 is also coming. And by the way, always be ready to go pawn to e5, because that's your main pawn break once the dust settles. That's why white plays rook e1 in this position, stopping that. But anyways, rook sc8, rook c1, bishop f4, bishop takes, queen takes, rook e3, and the game continues. Now, we'll look at other sidelines, namely the knight c3 line and the bishop c4 line. So, instead of pawn to e5, white may also play knight c3. In fact, this is what most doubting Thomases play, because they are trying to avoid theory. And to be honest, I hate this pawn to d5 line where you start competing on who reaches the king first. The simplest I can recommend here is to go knight c6, keeping your opponents guessing, not showing your cards immediately. Because with pawn to e5, it's now obvious you're trying to get back into the 4 knights game, and the game might be super boring. Not only that, you're not doing anything. Knight c6 prevents white from playing pawn to e5. If bishop c4, this is why you may want to play e6 followed by pawn to d5 and maybe d4 in the near future, or simply take on e4. This is just a common trap where you just go pawn to d5 and win back a piece. This is also great. They have to play bishop d3, after which you take, and then after bishop takes, you go pawn to e5, develop your bishop, castle shot. This is considered to be great for black. But after taking on e4, what if white takes your f7 pawn first? An intermediate move. This is still good for black. You can just take, and after knight takes, you go pawn to e5. If queen f3 check, the only thing you want to remember is that king g8 is losing in this particular position. So you always want to go back to e8 to keep things straight. For example, king g8, white may play knight g5 and you are doomed. For example, if you take, they have queen d5 checkmate. You can't take. If you play queen e8, they still have queen d5 check, and you have to give up your queen. Same with queen d7, they will just play queen d5 check, and you have to give up your queen. So the only move in the Alekhines defense in this particular line that you don't want to play is king g8. That's why the move is king e8, and from here Stockfish still favors black. You're going to find your way out. For example, after pawn to d3, paving way for their dark squared bishop, you can just go d5. So that if knight g5 comes this time, go queen d7, ensuring that your d5 pawn is protected and there's no checkmate. What else? Maybe knight e2, but you have bishop d6, and after castle shot, you go h6, chasing your enemy's piece away. All these queen check, but you always have king f8, and there's no anything here. f4, king g8, and now the knight is under big trouble. For example, if pawn takes, you can just take the knight, attack the queen before taking back. So that's one line I can recommend in the knight c3 line. Just start with your 2 knights without showing your cards too early, and if bishop c4, you go e6 d5, or simply knight takes followed by pawn to d5. If white plays the top played move in this position, pawn to d4. One move that is successful in this particular line is pawn to d5, so that if e5 happens, you can go knight g8. This is also a line favored by Magnus. The point is, after pawn to f4, you first play pawn to h5. Why? Because if you play a lazy move like bishop f5 in this position, this is different from the Caro-Kann. White has pawn to g4. Look at this, and you're going to be forced to go back. So you always want to start with h5 first, preventing g4, and after bishop e2, this is when you can play bishop f5. This looks dangerous, but trust me, you're not going to lose anything. First, you have rook takes h5, sacrificing a rook. If queen takes, there are all sorts of these things. Say pawn to g4, you have bishop g6. Once the queen goes back, you get back your rook. Oh, in this position, let's say white plays king f2, you can take, that's fine. You can play e6, that's okay. You can play bishop g6, but even better is knight h6, trying to do this, or bishop g4, h3, knight takes, rook b1, e6, pap. If this, by the way, that's just a free piece, because at the end of the day, you're going to win the knight, and the rook is hanging. So in this position, you can also give up your rook. So after pawn to d4, my favorite is just to go d5 and knight g8. But always remember to play pawn to h5 first before developing your light squad bishop. And be ready to sacrifice your rook to destroy the queen side completely. Lastly, what if white plays bishop c4 on the second move? So this is where they sacrifice their e-pawn. This is called the Krajicek variation. The trick here is that if you take what appears to be a free pawn, they can then sacrifice on f7. If you take back, they have queen h5 check, and if you play pawn to g6, this is how they win back their knight. But even after this, your position is still great. You can still continue playing. Just go bishop g7 and castle by hand. That's what Stockfish is saying. This is great. If queen f4 check, the only thing you need to remember is they are not really attacking your king. They are indirectly looking at your c7 pawn. So this is why you want to play king e8, just like I showed you, and then later on castle by hand like this. So this is the only thing you need to remember. If knight f3, you go rook f8, d4, you just go pawn to d5. By the way, even king g8 is okay. Pawn to d5 is more mature. Queen d3, you play king g8. This is okay according to Stockfish. But if you don't want to play what white expects to see, just to shut down everything, you can consider playing pawn to d5 immediately. You are attacking the bishop. Point is, if e takes d5, now you go knight takes d5. And there's a trick here. I love playing this myself with white, where I go knight c3, so that if black takes, I go queen f3, intending to give a check or something like that. But after this, you don't have to take. You just go knight b6, just like you do in a normal Alekhines defense. After bishop b3, you'd love to develop your light squad bishop out of the pawn chain, so you want to start with knight c6 first. And the moment you see knight f3, that's when you develop your light squad bishop, not on g4. These are tactics you always want to get used to. For example, if bishop g4, white may take on f7, and after king takes, they go knight g5 check. You are dead. So you still want to be tactically sharp. The move to play here is bishop f5, and then on the next move you just play e6, develop your bishop and castle shot. And that's how you avoid this Krajicek variation trap. You just play pawn to d5 again. After pawn to d5 and pawn takes, and then you take back. If they don't play knight c3, well and good. Sometimes they might play queen f3, but here you can just go e6 or just retreat. Knight e2, you have knight c6, castle shot, pawn to e5. Now in closing, let me just play a game. Let me try the Alekhines defense. This opening confuses a lot of people. One good thing about the Alekhines defense is that you have an option to transpose the game to the O'Sullivan Gambit, where you sacrifice your B pawn and your C pawn. Anyway, let me go knight d5. That's the idea. If pawn to c4, I have knight b6. Now this is what I'm talking about. Most of your opponents will be playing pawn to d4, so that if you play e6, they then play pawn to c4, chasing your knight back to b6. But what do I want to do in this position? Sacrificing my b pawn. Pawn to b5. and this is officially called the O'Sullivan Gambit for those of you who don't know. The idea is to sacrifice 2 pawns in the opening stage. If white takes, I have queen a5 check, and I'll probably win a free bishop. Frankly speaking, this is not a gambit you can trust, even in classical chess. It works well in rapid, blitz, and bullet, where people don't have much time to think. Against pawn to c3, I can still go queen a5 if I want, but the plan is still to take on d4, so that if pawn takes, I go queen a5 check and win that poor bishop. Since my opponent is doing everything right, I guess I could just, I just have to develop my e-pawn, also paving way for my dark squared bishop. There we see knight f3. I remember covering this line where I advised to go queen c7 because it prepares for bishop c5 in the near future. So nothing much, we're just down a pawn, but still with a comfortable position. Bishop b7 was also playable, by the way, just placing my bishop on the most active square to control this highlighted diagonal. Castle shot. So I can develop my bishop if I want to, but I'm scared of queen g4. I don't know what I'll do next. If I castle shot, there's bishop h6. So maybe the way to go is to develop my other knight. By the way, in case white took, I was just going to take back with my queen and play bishop b7. Pawn takes was also fine, but I find queen takes c6 to be reasonable. I just didn't expect my opponent was going to play queen back to d1, leaving the pawn on e5 hanging. And I should be very careful, my time is low. I don't know why a 2200 rated player would hang a bishop in this manner. Yeah, this is just losing. I'm also attacking the bishop, in case you don't know what is happening. So my opponent just resigned. That was a very bad game, very bad play. Hope to play another Alekhines defense game. So if you guys are having difficulties to choose the perfect opening that confuses your opponents, try the Alekhines defense. Even in classical chess, especially in tournaments, this works like magic. Not many people study the Alekhines defense nowadays, and there are not many people know how to defend against the Alekhines. Okay, let's go. Oh, I'm playing against a 2234 rated player, so e4, knight f6, the Alekhines defense. Now, if at all you guys didn't watch the video that I made on the Alekhines defense, I suggest that you watch it. The link is in the card above. So knight d5, that's the way to go. Plan is to go pawn to b5 next. Okay, we go b5. So if white takes, pawn to c5 is coming. Okay, bishop takes b5, so go c5. The plan is to go queen a5 check, plus winning the bishop, the light squared bishop. So normally, white takes on c5, which they shouldn't. Oh, pawn to c4. Okay, attacking my knight. So let me just take on d4. Idea is to still go queen a5 check. I mean, if pawn takes knight, I have queen a5 check, and white cannot defend on c3 with his knight because I'm just gonna capture with my pawn. Oh, now this is interesting. So what did we learn here? Knight b4 is the way to go, intending to go on c2 next. Yep, I think let's do that. Simply knight b4. Yes. So knight b4, the idea is to go on c2, forking the king, the rook, and the queen. That would be nice. Bishop b7 is also coming. Oh, can I go queen a5? Because that's the right continuation. Idea is to go knight c2, check. The queen cannot defend, cannot take my knight. I also have intentions of going pawn to e6. So if I go queen a5, knight c2 check, or let me just play e6. Okay, with e6 I still have an option of going queen a5. The pawn on a3 is pinned to the rook on a1, so white has to be careful. If pawn takes, I'll take the rook. And I also have ideas of going knight c2 check plus winning the rook on a1. Knight c2 will be check. Life is good for me. I don't know about my opponent. Okay, let's see what my opponent is going to do. At west I have bishop b7 eyeing the rook on h1, and s6 is also coming because, oh, knight d2, I have s6. Still, pawn takes, my knight doesn't work after s6. Okay, pawn to s6. Now white's light squared bishop is trapped, it has nowhere to go to. And if pawn takes my knight, the rook falls. Wow, that's amazing. I think white is losing now. I have too many threats. Taking on b4, taking on c1 with check, taking on b5. So many free things to take in this world. Now this is just a random chess player on Lichess. I don't even know him. He's not a paid actor. And oh, he just resigned. Oh, sorry dear. I just needed to beat you. I just needed to disappoint you. Anyways, let's do some quick analysis here. Let's just say white made a random move from here, knight f3 instead of knight e2. Here I would have just captured on b5 first, and after pawn takes I go knight s6 first, so that I do not hang my bishop on c8. This video was sponsored by all of our paid members on Patreon. These are the guys who support Casper Chess financially. In return, we give them extra study materials and other premium content on Patreon to thank them in style. Not to mention that all of our patrons are at liberty to make video requests and ask any chess related questions. You can join free membership and pay later if you want through the link in the comment section down below.